Before we talk about what happened at 05:17 in the northern Persian Gulf, we need to talk about what Iran's planners thought was going to happen, because this is the part of the story that almost no coverage is telling, and it is the part that matters most. Not just for understanding the engagement that unfolded in 17 minutes over the Gulf this morning, but for understanding what Iran does next. Iran did not send 70 aircraft into the Persian Gulf on a prayer. Iranian military planners spent years studying the geometry of the Gulf, the operating limitations of American carrier battle groups in confined maritime space, the specific vulnerabilities of the Aegis air defense architecture under saturation attack, and the exact timeline pressure that compressed radar horizons create for ship-based defensive systems. They were not wrong about any of that. The compressed geometry of the Persian Gulf genuinely does reduce reaction time for ship-based defenses. Coastal proximity genuinely does compress the engagement window for incoming missiles below what open ocean scenarios allow. Saturation genuinely can overwhelm a layered defensive architecture that is forced to solve too many simultaneous intercepts in too little time. The doctrine of mass and compression is not incorrect as a theory of how to challenge a technologically superior naval force in a confined maritime environment. Iran was right about the geometry. It was right about the physics. It was right about the pressure saturation creates. It was wrong about one thing, and that one thing is why 34 of its aircraft are burning on the surface of the Gulf this morning, and the Abraham Lincoln's flight deck is operational. Stay with me. Because understanding where Iran's plan was right is the only way to understand what comes next. And what comes next is the question every American naval planner is working on right now. What Iran knew, and it was a lot. The Persian Gulf is not open ocean. Every naval analyst who has ever modeled a conflict in this geography has reached the same conclusion. The Gulf is a compressed missile arena where the rules that govern carrier group operations in the Pacific or the Atlantic do not fully apply. The physics are not in dispute. Radar horizons in the Gulf, shaped by the curvature of the Earth, the shallow coastal shelf geometry, and the clutter produced by the dense sea surface at low altitudes, are dramatically shorter than in open water. A sea-skimming cruise missile traveling at transonic speed in the Gulf can emerge from the radar shadow of wave clutter at ranges that give ship-based defensive systems a fraction of the engagement time they would have against the same threat in open ocean. At 05:23 this morning, when 18 Iranian aircraft released 26 anti-ship cruise missiles at 71 nautical miles from the carrier group, those missiles entered the Gulf's compressed engagement geometry on purpose. Their sea-skimming trajectories, programmed to maintain 10 to 20 feet above the surface, were designed around the specific radar geometry of the Gulf, exploiting the clutter shadow to remain below the line of sight of surface ship search radars until the defensive system had minimal time to engage them sequentially. Iran also knew something specific about the Aegis architecture that its planners spent years studying. Aegis is extraordinarily capable against individual threats and against raids where threats arrive sequentially. Its single most significant vulnerability is the rate at which it can simultaneously solve multiple parallel intercept problems when the defensive system is simultaneously engaging aircraft at range while also engaging cruise missiles at closer range. Saturation, forcing Aegis to solve both problems at the same time with a finite number of interceptors, is the theoretically correct approach to challenging it. 70 aircraft releasing 26 missiles simultaneously while the combat air patrol is engaged with 70 aircraft is a rational attempt to create that simultaneous problem, not just tactically, mathematically. And Iran was correct that the geography of this engagement was favorable. The Gulf's compressed dimensions meant that the 26 cruise missiles, once released at 71 nautical miles, had a dramatically shorter intercept timeline available to the defensive system than open ocean geometry would have provided. Iran knew all of this. It planned around all of this. The doctrine was not unintelligent. Where the calculation broke down the E-2D Hawkeye, that is the specific capability that Iranian planning did not fully account for, or accounted for incorrectly, and it is the reason 34 aircraft are gone. The Hawkeye, orbiting 110 nautical miles south of Bandar Abbas, saw the raid before it had flown 10 miles from its launch point. Its AN/APY-9 radar painted 70 fast-moving returns, rising in 4 coordinated cells, simultaneously, building track data on every individual aircraft in the formation from the moment they lifted off, feeding that picture through a secure data link to every F-35C in the combat air patrol before the F-35s activated a single active radar emission of their own. The F-35Cs flew the entire opening engagement with their own radars cold. They did not need to transmit. They saw the Iranian formation completely, continuously, and with precision because the Hawkeye was doing the seeing for them. Every Iranian pilot who looked at his radar warning receiver saw nothing. No F-35 radar emissions, no targeting illumination, no indication of where the threat was coming from. The first indication most of them had that they were being engaged was the AIM-120D already in its terminal phase. Iranian planning assumed that air-to-air combat in the opening exchange would force the F-35s to activate their own radars, revealing their positions and allowing the F-14's long-range air-to-air missiles to achieve targeting solutions against them. That assumption is correct against most combat aircraft. It is wrong against the F-35C operating in a networked environment with the Hawkeye providing off-board targeting. The Growlers compounded this by fracturing the Iranian targeting picture from the opening of the engagement. Iranian fire control radars that were tracking the evolving tactical picture began flickering, not from jamming that prevented them from operating entirely, but from electronic attack that introduced enough noise to degrade the confidence of their tracks and delay the timing of tactical decisions by seconds. In a raid whose entire architecture depends on coordinated simultaneous execution, fighters holding the combat air patrol at range while strikers simultaneously reach the missile release point, seconds of timing delay are catastrophic. The mass compression doctrine requires the parts to arrive at their respective positions at the right moment. The Growlers ensured that the timing fell apart before the doctrine could execute as designed. The moment the plan fractured, 05:23. At 05:21:34, the first AIM-120D left an F-35C at 92 nautical miles from the carrier group, then 7 more. Before a single Iranian aircraft reached its missile release point, the Combat Air Patrol had put 8 long-range missiles into the fight from a formation that the Iranian radar picture showed as effectively empty airspace. The Iranian escorts reacted late. That is the tell. Late reaction to a weapons launch from an adversary whose radar you cannot see means the raid's command and control is already responding to events rather than executing a plan. 2 MiG-29s broke hard. 1 F-14 attempted a defensive maneuver. The chaff blooms appeared behind the missile's time of flight, not ahead of it. By 05:22, 4 Iranian aircraft were down before the formation reached its missile release point. The raid's timing was already compressed. At 05:23, the low-level strikers reached 71 nautical miles and executed their release, the most doctrinally correct moment of the entire operation, and the moment when Iranian planning was closest to achieving its objective. 26 sea-skimming missiles entered the Gulf's compressed geometry on schedule. If the doctrine had held together around them, if the escort fighters had succeeded in holding the F-35s at range, degrading their ability to transition to anti-ship missile engagement, the 26 missiles would have arrived at the Aegis defensive systems with the full weight of saturation that the doctrine intended. The doctrine did not hold together because the 8 AIM-120Ds from the first F-35C volley had already disrupted the formation's cohesion. The escort fighters were already managing their own survival rather than protecting the strike aircraft. And the 6 F-35Cs that descended slightly to engage the launch aircraft with additional missiles were able to do so because the Hawkeye was still feeding them a complete picture of the tactical situation, one that the Iranian side no longer had the coherent command structure to counter. The 26 missiles were the plan working. The fractured escort fighter formation was the plan failing. Both happened simultaneously. And when both happen simultaneously, the defensive system gets to solve the saturation problem with a fully intact and coordinated defensive architecture rather than against a raid that is still pressing home coherently. That is the difference between a saturation attack that works and a saturation attack that is handled. 05:24. Aegis does what it was designed to do. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer at 14 nautical miles ahead of the carrier group was not surprised. It was waiting. Aegis Baseline 9 illuminated the raid the moment it cleared the horizon at engagement range. SPY arrays stitched aircraft and cruise missiles into one coherent threat picture: altitude, speed, bearing, time to impact, and made that picture available to every ship in the screen simultaneously. The Air Defense Commander authorized SM-6 engagement on the highest energy tracks first, not the closest. The highest energy, the threats whose terminal phase geometry gave the inner defensive layers the least time to re-engage if the SM-6 intercept missed. That prioritization is the product of doctrine refined across decades of training. It is not improvised in combat. It is executed. 6 SM-6 launches, then 4 more from a second destroyer. The geometry was brutal and precise. Outer threats hit at maximum range, with mid-course updates flowing across the Aegis net between ships as missiles adjusted their intercept solutions. The first SM-6 obliterated an inbound cruise missile at 34 nautical miles. A second at 11 seconds later. A third. Iranian planners knew that Aegis would engage the SM-6 layer. They planned for some SM-6 kills. The doctrine assumed that 26 missiles were enough to overwhelm the SM-6 inventory of the screen ships before the missiles closed to ESSM range, because the SM-6 cells are finite, and if the outer layer expends its capacity against the first half of the raid, the second half arrives against a defensive system with a depleted long-range intercept capacity. The 26 missiles were not enough. The SM-6 layer handled the outer engagement without exhausting capacity, because the timing disruption produced by the Growlers and the Hawkeye networked F-35 formation meant that the 26 missiles were not arriving simultaneously. They were arriving in groups, first the ones released by aircraft that reached the release point first, then the others, which gave the Aegis network sequential intercept opportunities rather than simultaneous ones. Saturation that arrives sequentially is not saturation. It is a series of individual engagements that a sequential defensive system handles efficiently. The hit, and what it means. One US F-35C took fragment damage near the left tail from a near-miss air-to-air missile. It stayed in the fight for 23 more seconds, fired one more AIM-120D, scored a kill, then turned south under escort with warning lights on. A second F-35C absorbed superficial skin damage from a disintegrating MiG that shattered across its flight path. These hits matter in a way that the engagement's overall lopsided numbers might suggest they don't. Iran did not destroy 70 aircraft to lose 34, with no American losses. It committed a major air operation in the most favorable geography it had available. Confined waters, compressed engagement timelines, coastal proximity for its missile forces, and still managed to hit American aircraft. The F-35Cs took fragment damage. They were not killed, but they were hit. In Iranian after-action reviews, that fact will be noted carefully. The doctrine of mass and compression achieved partial penetration even against the most capable integrated air defense architecture in the world operating in a favorable configuration. Partial penetration means the doctrine has validity. It means that with adjustments, more missiles, different timing, better electronic warfare integration to prevent the Growlers from fracturing the raid's timing, the outcome changes. And the specific note that will drive Iranian planning forward: the 2 F-35Cs that sustained damage were hit by air-to-air threats, not by the cruise missile package. The cruise missile package of 26 missiles was entirely defeated by the ship-based defensive layers. The aircraft launch threats found the seam, however briefly, however shallowly, that 26 sea-skimming missiles did not. That is information. Iranian planners will use it. Phalanx, at 0.8 nautical miles. The final missile of the engagement, one sea-skimming weapon that survived every layer from SM-6 at 34 nautical miles through 2 ESSM volleys through the first phalanx burst, reached 0.8 nautical miles from the carrier. A destroyer had caught it at the edge of its engagement envelope. Miss. The missile kept coming. Lincoln's aft phalanx opened fire. Burst, correction, burst again. The missile exploded close enough that the shockwave rippled across the ship's wake. Every exposed sailor on the weather deck felt it in the chest. The fragments fell short. The line held at 0.8 nautical miles. Not at 34, not at 20, at 0.8. That is how close one missile got. That specific detail is the one that every naval analyst studying this engagement in every country on Earth is going to sit with longest. The outer layers performed as designed. The inner layers performed as designed. And still one missile reached 0.8 nautical miles. In a conflict where the geometry is more compressed, the timing is more favorable to the attacker, and the raid has better electronic warfare integration. At what point does the missile that reached 0.8 nautical miles reach 0? That is the question, not the 34 aircraft, not the 26 missiles defeated. The question is the one missile that made it to the phalanx, and what it would take, in a different raid with different timing, for that missile to be the first of 5 instead of the only one. The numbers and what they obscure. 0531, final accounting. 26 anti-ship missiles launched, 26 defeated, 34 Iranian aircraft destroyed outright, 9 more critically damaged, 1 F-35C lost, pilot recovered, 1 F-35C damaged but flyable, 2 sailors with shrapnel wounds, Abraham Lincoln, flight deck intact, catapults operational, arresting gear green, total elapsed decisive phase, 17 minutes. The numbers are correct. They are also incomplete. They tell you the outcome. They do not fully tell you the margin. The margin is the phalanx at 0.8 nautical miles. The margin is the 2 F-35Cs that took hits. The margin is the SM-6 inventory that was drawn down more significantly than the score sheet captures, because the Aegis network expended capability that now has to be resupplied while Iranian coastal batteries and fast attack boats remain active. Iran can claim scale. 70 aircraft committed to a carrier group engagement in the Gulf of Oman is an act of military ambition that no regional power has attempted against American naval forces in modern history. It cannot claim success, but the claim it will make internally, the claim that drives its next operational planning, is more precise than either success or failure. The claim will be, the doctrine had validity, the timing failed, fix the timing and the outcome changes. That is the correct analytical conclusion from the Iranian side's perspective. And it is the sentence that American naval planners are most focused on this morning, not the victory they won, but the question of what a raid that did not have its timing fractured by the Growlers looks like at the point where the missiles arrive at the defensive layers. What comes next? 3 things to watch that will tell you what Iran learned from 17 minutes this morning. The first, Iranian Air Force operational tempo in the next 2 weeks. If Iranian aircraft begin flying in smaller, more dispersed formations in the days following this engagement, not 70 in 4 coordinated cells, but 10 or 15 in smaller groups from more dispersed launch points, Iranian planners are working on the timing problem. Dispersed launches complicate the Growler's jamming geometry because the jamming aircraft cannot simultaneously degrade fire control radars from multiple disparate locations as effectively as it can against a concentrated formation. Small, dispersed, simultaneous launches are a different timing problem than a mass-coordinated raid. The second, the electronic warfare dimension. The Growlers fractured the raid's timing by degrading Iranian fire control radar confidence in the critical window before missile release. Iranian planners will now prioritize identifying and engaging the Growlers specifically as the first priority target of any future raid. Not the F-35Cs, not the carrier, the Growlers. Watch for any Iranian development or deployment of harm-equivalent anti-radiation missile capability targeted against the Growler's jamming emissions. That is the specific countermeasure to what defeated the timing of this raid. The third, cruise missile volume. 26 missiles against a fully awake and operationally coherent Aegis screen was not enough. Iranian planners know the number that would have been enough, or rather, they know the number is higher than 26 and are now working backward from the SM-6 and ESSM expenditure rate they observed this morning to calculate what that number is. Watch Iranian cruise missile production rates and any IRGC communication about anti-ship missile inventory announcements. Volume is the variable they can adjust most quickly, and above all, watch the phalanx. Not this engagement's phalanx moment, but the next one. The geometry of the Gulf means that every raid Iran attempts will have the same compressed timeline pressure on the defensive system. The question is whether future raids can produce 2 missiles at 0.8 nautical miles simultaneously rather than 1, because the phalanx that defeated a singleton at 0.8 nautical miles is a different calculation against 2 arrivals from different vectors at the same moment. That is the next problem, not the 34 aircraft, the phalanx geometry. 17 minutes, 70 aircraft, 34 destroyed, 26 missiles defeated, 1 carrier group intact, 2 sailors with shrapnel, 1 pilot recovered with a fractured wrist and burns to 1 hand. The doctrine Iran used this morning was not wrong. It was right about the geometry, right about the physics, right about where American carrier operations in the Gulf are constrained, right that saturation creates problems for Aegis that sequential raids do not. It was wrong about one thing: the Hawkeye and the Growler, operating as an integrated system with the F-35C formation, fractured the raid's timing before it could execute as designed. And a doctrine that is correct about everything except timing produces 34 aircraft burning on the surface of the Gulf. But here is the sentence that American planners are not publicizing this morning, because it is not the sentence that produces good press coverage. The doctrine came close enough to validate continued Iranian investment in getting it right. And the people who planned this morning's raid are not done planning.